A Japanese soldier is trying to fix an aircraft machine gun jammed with ice. His bare feet dangle above the frozen ground. The year is 1942 and he is fighting for the Empire of Japan in what will become known as the Battle of Midway. But this soldier isn't Japanese. He's actually from the island of Taiwan, which was occupied by the Japanese in 1937 and forcibly incorporated into their empire as its 36th prefecture. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they also simultaneously invaded the British, Dutch and French territories of Southeast Asia. By January 1942, Japanese troops had advanced into Burma, Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, capturing Singapore by February and the Philippines by May. By this point, the Japanese army was 800,000 strong and growing, composed not only of conscripted Taiwanese, but also volunteers from all over the empire, including Korea, China, Thailand and even the Soviet Union. They were led by some of the most brilliant tacticians in military history, men like General Yamashita and Admirals Mikawa and Yamamoto. Their goal, conquer the Western Pacific and force the Americans to their negotiating table. But the Japanese advance would soon hit an unexpected snag. In June 1942, American forces decisively defeated them at the Battle of Midway, inflicting catastrophic losses in men and materials. This defeat marked a turning point in the war, after which the Japanese began losing territory until finally being pushed back to their home islands in 1945. The cost of the war in lives and resources devastated Japan and its occupied territories. In recent years, scholars have begun to re-examine the Second World War, not just as a conflict between the Axis and the Allies, but also as a war within a war, one fought not only across the globe, but also across a multitude of cultural and racial divides. In today's episode, we'll be exploring how people from colonized and occupied regions fought for the Japanese war effort and what happened to them when the Japanese lost. By the 1930s, most of Asia and the Pacific had fallen under colonial rule. European powers exploited these territories for their natural resources and cheap labor, while the local population suffered under harsh economic conditions and brutal suppression. When Japan began its campaign of conquest in the region, many of the local people saw it as a chance to throw off the colonial yoke. For example, many Indonesians and Filipinos fought with the Japanese because they hated the Dutch or the Americans. Others joined the Japanese out of fear of the advancing communists. Still, others simply wanted to take advantage of the chaos to loot and pillage. As the Japanese conquered more territory, they created puppet states to govern them, such as the Republic of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which purportedly aimed to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. But in reality, these puppet states were little more than rubber stamps for Japanese authority. Local collaborators served in the Japanese military, worked in government positions, or managed the economy. Some, like the Taiwanese soldier we mentioned earlier, were forced into service. Others volunteered, believing that the Japanese were truly trying to liberate their countries from Western imperialism. However, as the tide of the war turned and it became clear that Japan was going to lose, many of these volunteers and collaborators switched sides, hoping to curry favor with the victors. But this proved to be a risky strategy. Although the Americans accepted many Asians into their armed forces, most were relegated to menial tasks and none were allowed to actually fight. The British, on the other hand, were less forgiving. They viewed all Japanese collaborators as potential security threats and either imprisoned or executed them. At the end of the war, Japanese soldiers who had come from Taiwan, Korea and other occupied territories faced a terrible choice: stay loyal to an empire that had oppressed them or return home to face the wrath of the nationalist government that had been installed by the victorious Allies. Many chose to surrender to the Americans, hoping for a better post-war life. But they soon found out that their former captors were no better than the empire that they had deserted. As the Cold War began, Washington began viewing anyone who had collaborated with the Japanese as a potential communist spy, regardless of whether or not they had actually been involved in espionage. Hundreds of thousands of former Japanese soldiers from occupied territories were arrested, tortured and sent to prison camps where they were forced to work in the most menial jobs. Many died of exhaustion or mistreatment. Those that survived were eventually released, but only after having been branded traitors to their nation. The legacy of shame has lasted until today, with many families choosing to hide their relatives' wartime experiences out of fear of social stigma. However, thanks to the efforts of historians and activists, more and more people are coming forward to share their stories and preserve the memory of those who fought in a forgotten war. If you enjoyed this video, Check out our other content, where we bring you the finest in historical tales and analysis. And remember to subscribe to get more of our fact-driven, unbiased historical narratives.